11:52 p.m. 8 cruise missiles, 1 U.S. base. Launch sequence initiated. 5 seconds to ignition, then 0 missiles fired. One question: how? For months, Russian naval vessels in Mediterranean conducted aggressive operations near Syria, shadowing U.S. ships, testing coalition defenses, demonstrating strike capability. But on December 3rd, when Russian frigate actually attempted to launch cruise missiles at American forces, the weapons never left their launch tubes. Not mechanical failure, not crew error. Something else prevented launch. Something the Russian captain couldn't understand, couldn't explain to Moscow, couldn't defend against. Because 40,000 feet above, US Navy P-8 Poseidon had been broadcasting signals the Russian crew never detected. Signals that infiltrated ships' weapon systems, signals that convinced Russian missiles they were already launched, already in flight, already expended. Electronic warfare so sophisticated, it didn't jam communications or disable radar. It spoke directly to weapons in their own language, giving false commands that missiles believed were real. When Russian captain ordered launch, missiles thought they'd already fired. Launch cells stayed closed, tubes stayed sealed. Kalibr cruise missiles sat dormant while their computers registered successful flight to target. What happened in those 5 seconds changed Russian naval doctrine, forced complete weapon system redesign, and proved that electronic warfare has evolved beyond jamming and disruption into something far more dangerous: deception at the weapon system level. The Mediterranean Sea, approximately 2.5 million square kilometers of strategic water where European, Middle Eastern, and North African interests converge. Since 2015, Russian Navy maintained permanent Mediterranean squadron operating from Tartus Naval Base in Syria. The squadron typically included 4 to 6 warships, 1 or 2 submarines, support vessels. Purpose: support Russian military operations in Syria, demonstrate naval power projection, counter NATO presence, protect Syrian regime. Russian operations in Syria began September 2015 when Moscow intervened to prevent Syrian government collapse. Russian air power, military advisors, naval support turned tide of civil war. Cruise missile strikes from ships and submarines became signature Russian capability. Kalibr cruise missiles launched from Mediterranean striking targets hundreds of kilometers inland. The strikes served dual purpose: destroy opposition forces and demonstrate Russian long-range precision strike capability to international audience. United States maintained counter-presence, Navy vessels patrolling Eastern Mediterranean, Air Force operating from bases in Turkey, Jordan, Iraq. Army Special Forces at Al-Tanf base in southeastern Syria, strategic outpost controlling desert crossing between Syria and Iraq, blocking Iranian land corridor, training Syrian opposition forces. Al-Tanf represented American commitment to maintaining presence despite Russian dominance. Tensions between Russian and American forces were managed through deconfliction protocols, hotline between commands, agreed separation zones, rules to prevent accidental engagement. But beneath professional military communication, strategic competition intensified. Russia wanted US out of Syria. America refused to abandon positions. Neither side willing to escalate to direct combat, but both seeking leverage. Russian strategy evolved into what analysts called signaling through demonstration. Launch cruise missiles near US positions, show American forces that Russian weapons could reach their bases, create psychological pressure, force Washington to question whether Syrian presence was worth risking casualties from Russian strike. Never actually target American forces, that meant war, but demonstrate capability, imply threat, achieve strategic effect through intimidation. By late 2023, this strategy had become routine. Russian warships would approach Syrian coast, conduct launch rehearsals visible to US surveillance, fire missiles at Syrian opposition targets near American positions, prove Russian missiles worked and American bases were vulnerable. Moscow calculated that repeated demonstrations would eventually convince Washington to withdraw, but there was a fundamental flaw in strategy. It required Russian weapons to function reliably. Demonstrations only create psychological impact if weapons actually launch, fly, hit targets. If missiles fail publicly, strategy collapses. Intimidation requires credibility. Credibility requires capability. Capability requires working weapons. On November 28th, U.S. intelligence detected increased Russian naval activity off Syrian coast. Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate Admiral Essen departed Tartus, proceeded to position 12 nautical miles from shore, began what appeared to be strike preparation. The frigate carried 8 M54 Kalibr cruise missiles in vertical launch system, range 2,500 kilometers, accuracy within 3 meters, warhead 450 kilograms, capable of striking any target in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, or Turkey. US Navy P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft immediately deployed from Naval Air Station Sigonella in Sicily. The P-8, modified Boeing 737, carried advanced sensors, electronic warfare systems, anti-ship missiles. Primary mission: track Russian vessels, monitor activities, collect intelligence. Secondary mission: conduct electronic warfare if needed. Over next 4 days, Admiral Essen conducted launch rehearsals. Crew went through targeting procedures, fire control activation, launch sequences, everything except actually firing missiles. US P-8 monitored every step, recording radio frequencies, analyzing radar emissions, mapping weapon systems. Intelligence analysts noted rehearsals were unusually thorough, suggesting actual strike might be imminent. On December 2nd, intercepted communications indicated Russian frigate received targeting package from Syria Command. Coordinates matched US Al-Tanf base. Intelligence assessment: Russia planning demonstration strike, not on base itself, but close enough to send message. Launch could occur within 24 hours. At 3 p.m. December 2nd, U.S. Central Command held secure video conference. Topic: Russian apparent preparation to launch cruise missiles near Al-Tanf. Question: how should U.S. respond? Options discussed: diplomatic protest, military posturing, warning Russia against strike, preparing defensive measures at Al-Tanf. Then one participant, Navy electronic warfare specialist, proposed different option. What if missiles never launch? What if we prevent strike without firing a shot, without Russia knowing we intervened? The proposal centered on highly classified electronic warfare capability developed over previous 5 years. Weapons system intrusion. Not jamming, which enemy detects immediately. Not cyber attack, which requires network access. Something different. Broadcasting false commands on frequencies weapon systems use internally, convincing weapons they're in different state than actual reality. The concept was elegant. Russian Kalibr missiles communicate with launch control via encrypted data link on specific frequency. Messages include targeting data, status updates, launch commands. U.S. electronic warfare systems had analyzed Kalibr communications for years, partially broken encryption, identified command protocols. Could U.S. broadcast false status messages that missiles would believe were legitimate? Specifically, could U.S. convince missiles they'd already launched? Kalibr design includes safety feature: missiles won't fire if system thinks they're already airborne, prevents accidental double launch. If U.S. could inject false in-flight status messages into missile data link, missiles would refuse launch commands. Fire control computer would show error. Launch would fail. Russian crew wouldn't know why. The risk was significant. If Russians detected U.S. electronic warfare, escalation could follow. If false signals failed, missiles would launch normally and strike Syrian opposition, possibly near U.S. forces. But potential reward was equally significant. Prevent strike without violence, demonstrate electronic warfare superiority, create operational uncertainty in Russian Navy about weapon reliability. At 6 p.m. December 2nd, Central Command authorized operation. P-8 Poseidon would maintain continuous surveillance. If Russian frigate initiated actual launch sequence, electronic warfare systems would activate, broadcasting false in-flight status to Kalibr missiles. Operation codenamed Silent Shield. At 9 p.m., December 3rd, Admiral Essen changed position, moving to optimal launch position 12 nautical miles offshore. P-8. Poseidon maintained station at 40,000 feet, 80 kilometers away. Crew activated advanced electronic surveillance, monitoring every Russian emission. Onboard electronic warfare officer received final authorization. If launch sequence detected, activate weapon system intrusion immediately. At 11:30 p.m., Russian frigate's fire control radar activated. Launch preparation beginning. At 11:40 p.m., vertical launch cells opened. Missiles elevated to firing position. At 11:45 p.m., targeting computers activated. Flight paths calculated. At 11:50 p.m., crew reported ready to launch. Russian captain ordered, "Prepare to fire on my command." At 11:52 p.m., launch sequence initiated. In Russian Fire Control Center, weapons officer entered launch code. Computer began countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire command transmitted to missile battery. Launch cells pressurized. Ignition circuits activated. Simultaneously, 40,000 feet above, P-8 Poseidon detected launch initiation. Electronic warfare officer activated weapon system intrusion. High-powered transmitter began broadcasting on Kalibr data link frequency. False status messages: Missile 1 airborne, Missile 2 airborne, Missile 3 airborne. All 8 missiles receiving identical false status. You have already launched. You are in flight. Do not respond to additional launch commands. The Kalibr missile's onboard computers received conflicting information. Fire control system ordering launch. Internal status showing already launched. Safety protocols designed for exactly this scenario. If system shows in-flight status, ignore new launch commands. Prevent accidental double fire. Missiles remained in cells. Launch mechanism stayed locked. Ignition circuits deactivated. On Russian frigate, fire control screens showed error messages. Launch failure, system fault. Weapons officer reported to captain, "Sir, launch aborted. Missiles not responding to fire command." Captain ordered, "Override and retry." Second launch attempt, same result. Error messages, no ignition, no launch. Emergency diagnostic routines activated. Engineers examining system logs found impossible data. Missiles reporting in-flight status while physically remaining in launch cells. Guidance systems showing coordinates, altitude, speed, all consistent with flight, but missiles were clearly stationary. Some sensors said missiles hadn't moved. Other sensors said missiles were 100 kilometers downrange. Russian captain faced decision: continue troubleshooting, abort mission, report to command. At 11:58 p.m., he transmitted to Syria headquarters. Strike mission aborted due to weapon system malfunction. Nature of failure unclear. All missiles non-responsive to launch commands. Request instructions. Response from command came at 12:15 a.m. Return to port. Engineering team will investigate system failure. Do not discuss incident on unsecure channels. Admiral Essen began transit back to Tartus. Aboard P-8 Poseidon, crew watched Russian frigate withdraw. Electronic warfare officer secured intrusion systems. Mission successful. Crew's missile strike prevented without firing shot, without Russian crew knowing US had intervened. To Russians, this appeared as mysterious technical failure. Weapons malfunction at worst possible moment. Over following week, Russian engineers investigated Admiral Essen's weapon systems thoroughly. Found no mechanical faults, no software errors, no explanations for why 8 missiles simultaneously refused launch commands. System logs showed conflicting data, impossible readings that didn't match reality. Engineers submitted report. Unexplained weapon system failure. Recommend complete diagnostic overhaul of all Kalibr-equipped vessels. But within Russian Navy, questions multiplied. Was this isolated incident, random failure, or something else? Could Americans have interfered? But how? US aircraft was 80 kilometers away. No jamming detected, no cyber intrusion. Russian classified analysis eventually concluded. Possible adversary electronic warfare capability targeting weapon systems directly. Mechanism unknown, countermeasures unclear. The incident had immediate strategic impact. Russian Mediterranean squadron received orders: suspend all cruise missile operations until weapons system security review completed. No demonstration strikes, no signaling through capabilities, because demonstrations only work if weapons work, and Russian command couldn't guarantee reliability. For 4 months, no Russian cruise missile launches occurred from Mediterranean. Syrian operations continued with aircraft, artillery, ground forces, but signature long-range strike capability was suspended. The gap was noticed. Syrian opposition observed decreased Russian missile activity. US intelligence documented operational pause. International analysts questioned whether Russian Navy had lost confidence in its own weapons. Russian engineers worked frantically to understand what happened. Analysis of electromagnetic spectrum at time of incident showed unusual signals on frequencies near Kalibr data link bands. Not jamming, not noise, structured transmissions. Implications were troubling. Someone had accessed weapon system communication protocols, transmitted data missiles accepted as legitimate commands. Security review expanded to all Russian naval weapon systems. Encryption upgraded. Communication frequencies changed. New authentication protocols implemented. But fundamental problem remained. If adversary understands weapon system language well enough to speak it convincingly, any command could be spoofed. And if weapons can be convinced they've already fired, or that firing is unsafe, or that target coordinates are wrong, entire system becomes unreliable. By April 2024, Russian Navy cautiously resumed Mediterranean cruise missile operations, but with new restrictions. Mandatory electronic warfare detection sweeps before launch, communications analysis to verify no intrusion, backup manual launch capabilities. The confident demonstration launches of previous years became careful, monitored operations conducted only when Russian command was certain no interference was possible. U.S. intelligence assessed the incident created lasting operational impact. Russian Navy now questioned weapon reliability in contested electromagnetic environment. Planning for strikes near U.S. forces had to account for possibility of launch failure. Demonstration strategy, showing capability to intimidate opponent, was compromised because capability was no longer assured. The incident also revealed to Russia that U.S. electronic warfare had evolved beyond known categories. Jamming and cyber attack were understood threats with known countermeasures. But weapon system intrusion, false command injection accepted by weapons as legitimate, represented new paradigm. Russia didn't know extent of U.S. capability. Which weapons were vulnerable? Just Kalibr? Or anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, torpedoes? Uncertainty paralyzed offensive planning. Strategic implications extended beyond Russia. China's People's Liberation Army studied incident closely. Chinese missiles relied on similar data link communication for fire control. If U.S. could spoof Russian weapons, could they spoof Chinese systems? PLA invested heavily in electronic warfare countermeasures, secured communication protocols, redundant launch mechanisms. The arms race shifted from building better weapons to protecting weapons from electronic deception. For United States, Silent Shield Operation validated decade of investment in offensive electronic warfare. Traditional approach, jamming enemy communications, disrupting radar, was defensive. New approach, speaking enemy weapons language, giving false commands, was offensive. Didn't destroy enemy systems, made them unreliable, created doubt, forced adversaries to question whether their weapons would function when needed. But capability had limitations. Required detailed intelligence on adversary weapons protocols. Required proximity. Electronic warfare aircraft had to be in range during launch sequence. Required adversary using standard procedures. Unexpected tactics might circumvent intrusion. And required secrecy. If adversary understood mechanism, countermeasures would follow. December 3rd incident remained classified. U.S. never acknowledged involvement. Russia never publicly admitted launch failure. But within classified military channels, both sides understood what happened. American electronic warfare prevented Russian missile strike without firing shot, without escalation, without Russia knowing with certainty what occurred. Weapons that never launched because they believed they already had. Today, Admiral Essen remains in Russian service, but hasn't conducted cruise missile operations near U.S. positions since December 2023. Russian Mediterranean Squadron maintains presence, but demonstration strikes ceased. Moscow's strategy of intimidation through weapons demonstration couldn't survive weapons that might not work. The frigate that was supposed to pressure US into withdrawing instead revealed Russian vulnerability to electronic warfare they couldn't detect or defend against. 11:52 p.m. 8 cruise missiles armed. Launch sequence initiated. 5 seconds to ignition. 11:52 p.m. and 5 seconds. 0 missiles launched. Russian captain sees only system error. Doesn't know US aircraft 80 kilometers away. Just spoke to his weapons in their own language. Doesn't know missiles believe they already fired. Doesn't know his demonstration of power became demonstration of vulnerability. Strike prevented. Escalation avoided. All through electronic warfare so sophisticated Russian crew never detected it. This is modern naval combat. This is electronic deception. This is what happens when weapon systems can be convinced reality isn't real. The missiles that never launched because they thought they already had. And the frigate that returned to port not knowing enemy had been inside its fire control system, speaking to its weapons, preventing war without firing a shot.